Hello, everyone. Welcome back to one of our Through the Bible studies. Today, we're going to be going through the book of Obadiah. Normally, we would caution you against considering this a replacement for personal Bible study. However, since this is only a book with one chapter, I figure we can go verse by verse through it. So, we'll consider this a full-fledged Bible study. Who wrote the book of Obadiah? We're actually not sure. His name was Obadiah, but his name, that name rather, appears 13 times in the Old Testament, and yes, applying to 13 different individuals. The ones that would most directly apply, we can narrow it down to possibly 4, but because all of the manuscripts that we have of the book of Obadiah date to the latest that the book of Obadiah could have been written was in the 6th century BC, so 600 years before Christ. That's where we lay it down to. However, we don't know if there are earlier manuscripts than that, but there certainly aren't later. We do know, however, that the latest that we do have Obadiah written would be, in all intents and purposes, a writing that would have been a copy. We don't have the original. So we can conclude that Obadiah would or may have been earlier. We just haven't discovered a copy of it yet. However, because of the dates that would check out, we basically just have to look at the historical context and conclude that this was one of these Obadiahs. One of which was an officer who worked in the court of King Ahab. Yes, that King Ahab, the husband of Jezebel and the king that hunted down and murdered prophets of God. He basically did the same thing that many people in Nazi Germany did by opening their homes and hiding Jews from the Nazi government. Well, Obadiah, in that situation, in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, he hid prophets of God in his home, or rather in a cave that he had exclusive access to, and therefore King Ahab was not able to get a hold of him. It may have been that Obadiah that God used to speak this word. Another example, and a better one, that we would conclude would be a Bible teacher who served King Jehoshaphat. Last study in the books of Amos, I accidentally said Jehoram. I apologize for that. It was Jehoshaphat who had the battle with the Edomites. And Edom was the book, or rather, are the people that this book is directly addressing and speaking to. Because of the direct association, people would say, yeah, probably that Obadiah, but here's essentially what happened there if you don't remember. Jehoshaphat was in a place where Edom and several other nations had combined their efforts to destroy Israel, and Jehoshaphat said, look, God, if you don't come through with us, we're toast. But when they took the time to restore their relationship with God, interestingly enough, at the same time, the Edomites and the other 2 nations that were combining to destroy Israel decided suddenly their relationships with each other weren't worth having anymore, and they killed each other. So when a prophet of God came up, that one, and told Jehoshaphat, God's going to give you victory over your enemies here today, they marched with their worship team up front. They were praising God. The priests were just celebrating, leading songs and choirs, and the military was behind them instead of the other way around. And when they got to the battle, everyone had killed themselves. So while Israel restored his relationship with God, the Edomites and their friends had all broken their relationships with each other. I find that ironic. That's another example of the Obadiah that may have been speaking, since his prophecy is specifically speaking to the Edomites. Another example was a overseer of temple repair during the reign of King Josiah. Would have been the first time that just a prophecy was spoken as warning to God's enemies while things were going on in the nation of Israel that wouldn't directly associate with that. I tend to think it may have been the Jehoshaphat guy, but that's just my opinion, because they also believe that due to the date of this, it may have been earlier but not later. Might have been written during the time of Nehemiah, that Obadiah was one of the priests that was serving while Nehemiah was restoring Israel's infrastructure, rebuilding their walls. And all of these things are essentially the idea as to whether or not it was this Obadiah or that one. Doesn't make too much of a difference because we're not talking about Obadiah specifically. His book is talking about the Edomites, and we know plenty about them. This is a book of prophecy, so it's not Obadiah speaking from his perspective, but it is God speaking through this man whose name was Obadiah. 6th century BC, that's the earliest that we would date it to, so basically set conclusion on that, and it is addressed to the Edomites, specifically their capital city of Petra. It's still standing today, by the way, but not the original occupants and constructors, mind you. What is the topic of this book? Edom's judgment. As you recall, when we discussed this previously in the book of Amos, right before this book, Amos had no shortage of stern words for the Edomites. He was the only nation that basically was said, you are about to cross a line here. The other nations already would. They were told judgment's coming. But Edom, they basically had been said, look, you're at strike 2. Be careful, because if you cross strike 3, God says you're out of here. We'll be treating you just like the Philistines are about to be treated. And, of course, why does Obadiah have the right to say these sort of things with the authority of God? Well, because he didn't just claim to be a prophet, but according to his ministry, he passed the test of that prophet. 100% accuracy on the events he recorded, both in past, present, and with support of miracles, the future, to show that God was involved in this. That's the second standard. And then lastly, of course, consistency with the character of God. He is in fact a God of justice and will not let crime go unpunished. He wants to offer mercy first, but if you reject mercy, what's left? Not what you want. So let's start with verse 1, the vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. And in parentheses it reads, we have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations, saying, arise, and let us rise up against her for battle. Uh-oh. Who is this Edom, and why does God have something to say to her? Well, Edom, a word that just simply means red, is the nation that came from Esau, and that name means hairy. Esau was the older twin brother of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and it's from his 12 sons that the nation of Israel is composed of today. They were relatives, to a degree, of the people of Israel, and their territory was just the southwest of Israel's borders. Genesis 25 gives us the history. You can read it on your own time. But long story short, Esau was supposed to inherit a promise of God, being the firstborn son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham, through whom God promised, through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, speaking of Jesus. But before they were born, Isaac's wife, Rebecca, had twins, and they were very, let's just say it wasn't pleasant living quarters for her or the homeowner. Let's just say that way. And she prayed to God, why is my pregnancy this hard? And God told her, you have 2 nations fighting in your womb, and the older shall serve the younger. Now, normally in Middle Eastern culture, it was the other way around. Whoever was born first, even if they were twins, even if it was just by a few minutes, they were the ones who would inherit all of the legal, financial, social, and spiritual blessings that were a part of that home. However, God told Rebekah before these twins even came out of the womb that the one born second will be the one to inherit the promises, not the first. And it worked the same way with Isaac. Ishmael was the first biological born son of Abraham, but the problem was he was born outside of God's plan. God wanted a miraculous child given to Abraham so that he would understand that God was the one who would see him have more children than stars, to see every promise on his life fulfilled. And so the firstborn went to the secondborn, just like in that again, and just like the firstborn right passed to Judah for Israel, the firstborn son of Israel was Reuben. So God clearly isn't following this sort of standard here. And it's actually also interesting, everyone that God used was going against cultural norms. If you look at David, for example, he wasn't the firstborn son of Jesse. He was the youngest son of Jesse. If we look, again, I can go all day into all of this, but you get the point. So Jacob was the one called by God, but Esau was the one who was called by ceremony. Esau was kind of cocky. I mean, he was a little bit more hairy than I am, but with all that being said, very outdoorsy kind of guy, hunter type personality, but also didn't consider his relationship with God a priority. Jacob wasn't perfect either, but he's the one that God had called. And instead of waiting to see how God would work that out, he decided to take it into his own hands and be the little schemer that he was. Because when all the way from the time they were born, in fact, pre-gestation, they were fighting in their mama's womb. But when they were coming out of mama, Esau was born first, and the only thing that came to their parents' mind when they saw him was hairy. So, baby's born. Chewbacca, okay. That's what came to mind. But when they pulled Esau out of mom, there was a little hand holding on to his heel. He's trying to pull him back like, a bunch of grade schoolers trying to keep the other one from getting ahead in a race. He was trying to cheat, and so they named Jacob Cheater, heel catcher. And that's why God renamed him Israel, not just for social reasons, but for spiritual as well. Now, again, Jacob, instead of waiting to see how God would work this out, decided to take it into his own hands. Being the cheater that he was, he decided to cheat his older brother out of his birthright. He came home from hunting. He was tired. He was hungry. And Jacob was cooking some red lentil soup. You see where the nickname will come in a moment. Esau said, "Let me swallow that." And Jacob decided to take advantage of his brother's hunger and said, "You want this soup? Sell me your birthright." No, not on paper. I want it legally binding. This isn't just a handshake here. And, well, he, drama queen in the moment, as Levi Lusko put it, he says, "What good is my birthright to me if I'm starving to death?" So he sold his birthright, and when Jacob went through with it legally, Esau had seller's remorse and decided to get back at his brother Jacob by killing him the moment that their father died. So Jacob runs away from home. He comes under the employee / housing arrangement. He just basically moves in with this guy was a relative of his mother Rebecca, named Laban. And Laban was an even bigger cheater than Jacob, because when he was attracted to one of his daughters, understand this was pre-Moses, so near close relations wasn't immoral yet, both in a biological and spiritual sense. His first cousin once removed, Rachel, was beautiful. Her older sister, Leah, not so much. He wanted to marry Laban's daughter, and so Laban said, "Work for me for 7 years and you've got her." And, it's nice and romantic about it. He worked the full years, but it seemed like only a few days to him because of how much he loved Rachel. But when it finally came time for the wedding, apparently Laban, spiked the alcohol or something. It was dark at the honeymoon suite, and so when it was time for them to consummate the marriage, Laban switched the sisters so that big ugly sister Leah, you may seem like that sounds mean, but we're just being honest here. Leah was married to him first, and so Jacob had to work another 7 years to get the wife he wanted. When two sisters marry the same guy, it's bad enough they're fighting for the attention of guys then, but it's even worse when you're having to share the same guy spiritually. And so they had a little baby blitz, and that's how the 12 kids were born. But that's a different study altogether. Oh, man. Anyway, reason number 536 as to why polygamy is a bad idea. It wasn't Jacob's idea, it was Laban's scheme, but nonetheless, he leaves. And when he's called by God to return back home, he finds out that Esau, who hasn't seen him in decades, remember? He's coming to meet him with a few hundred friends. This isn't going to end well. So Jacob, he's like, "Oh no, how am I going to sort this out?" And after pulling a few boneheaded moves and God having to set things up where he had no choice but to trust him, at the last possible second, Esau's mindset, which more than likely was to kill Jacob, did a 180. And the moment that they met each other, Esau's like, "Hey, welcome back. It's good to see you again. I can't wait to meet all my nieces and nephews. How are you doing?" And he's like, "So you're not going to kill me?" He says, "Dude, that water under the bridge. No problems here." And so Jacob obviously didn't trust him at his word, but on Esau's terms, it was over and done with. God had done something in his heart, or like he did with Laban a few hours before, had confronted him sternly and told him, "Don't touch him, or you're messing with me." Esau had no problems anymore with Jacob. However, Esau's kids didn't get that memo. They bore the grudge that hairy grandpa let go of. And it was over this time in Israel's history that this constant bitterness just defined Israel's relationship with their distant cousins, the Edomites. And this first strike, essentially, that made them not only an obstacle but an enemy of the people of Israel was when in the book of Numbers Moses was leading the people of Israel to the promised land. They had finished their 40 years wandering in the desert and they were ready to trust God again, kind of, and they were going to pass the territory of Edom. Now, they were upfront about the fact that they were just passing through, that they weren't going to, take anything, and even if their animals just so happen to drink the water, we'll pay you for it. We'll stay on the highway. We're not here to mess with you. We're family here. Well, the king of the Edomites at that time said, no, you're not entering into this territory, and if you do, we'll consider it an act of war. So Moses had to go the long way around the Edomites, adding a few extra weeks to already an arduous trip for him, and also ended up running into a few enemies between then and there. So the first strike, so to speak, was them being an obstacle for them entering into the promised land. Not obviously a judgment from God level offense, but still annoying. The second strike was when things started to get a little dicey, because as Israel made their way into the promised land, established a nation for themselves, Edom's right here, Israel's right here. Well, every time Israel became weak militarily, they made a habit of performing bandit runs by kidnapping and robbing the people that were basically left unprotected whenever the armies were away. So the kings of Israel had to consider the Edomites a liability, something you had to constantly keep in mind as a hazard rather than a help. And it was ultimately the strike on their account when the nations that gathered together under the reign of King Jehoshaphat, once again, as you remember, they joined the enemies of Israel in war against them. God dealt with them when they acted on it, but understand that they had made a move against God's people militarily. They didn't fight in a battle yet, but they were about to, and that was a serious mark against their record. So strike one, stopping them, being an obstacle to them receiving the promises of God. Strike two, wanting to engage the people of Israel in battle and constantly harassing them, and even being responsible for the kidnapping and robbery of his people in the south. Now strike three was a line they were about to cross, and Obadiah makes them aware of it. Verse 2, Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be greatly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock. Notice if you look at Petra, the capital of the Edomites region today, it's a city that's basically carved out of a mountain. And so that's where they would call themselves. That's where they would call themselves home. I can speak. Anyway, whose habitation is high, you who say in your heart, who will bring me low to the ground? Though you ascend as high as the eagle, and though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. If thieves had come to you, catch the reference? If robbers by night, oh, how you will be cut off. Your big, massive nation, with your giant castle, fortress city that's built into a mountain, a little band of robbers completely will annihilate you. Would they have not have stolen until they had enough? If grape gatherers, just people trying to sneak out, shoplifters basically, if the grave gatherers had come to you, would they not have left some gleanings? Oh, how Esau shall be searched out. I guess that would be a note for farming, but understand this. How his hidden treasures shall be sought after. All the men in your confederacy shall force you to the border. The men at peace with you shall deceive you and prevail against you. Reference to their history. Those who eat your bread shall lay a trap for you. No one is aware of it. I will not in that day, says the Lord, even destroy will I not, rather, in that day, says the Lord, even destroy the wise men from Edom, and understanding from the mountains of Esau. Then your mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed, to the end that everyone from the mountains of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. Bandits of robbers, grape gatherers, and again, even in a peaceful sense, just people who are gathering the harvest, right? It was required by law in the nation of Israel to leave the corners of the field in order for poor people who couldn't work for themselves or were still looking for work, they would still be able to gather food, but they'd have to go and work for it. They'd go into the fields, the corners, and gather the corners of the field, and that was deliberately left as essentially a welfare system for Israel. Either way, if it's referring to a shoplifter or someone who's just basically sparing parts of the field for the poor. Either way, he says, is a robber going to take over a country? It will with you. Don't you think that a grape gleaner will leave at least some behind? Not with you. You're going to be completely cleared out. It doesn't matter how strong, how high your fortresses are, or how clever you think you are going to be destroyed. The smallest of threats, let alone the big one that is about to head your way, if you don't get your acts together, will ultimately see you destroyed. No alliances, because they'll betray you. No tricks, because they'll ultimately come back on you. Nothing, not even your massive fortress city, will save you at this point. Verse 10. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces. Catch the reference? When foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. He's referencing Jehoshaphat. When my people were vulnerable, you marched against them in war. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of your destruction, of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among them who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of his distress. When Israel was taken over, they essentially made sure that the prisoners couldn't escape. They captured them and sold them for bounty to the people who just took over their city. They weren't providing refuge. They were essentially the ones that just made life even more miserable, having escaped a bad situation. When I was punishing them, you only made it worse, and I did not call you to that. You can tell there's a lot of smoke in these words, so to speak. For the day of the Lord, remember in Joel, that's never a good thing, upon all nations is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. For your reprisal shall return upon your own head. For as you drank on my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yes, they shall drink and swallow, and they shall be as though they had never been. So essentially understand this. God doesn't punish them without telling them why. They were carrying a grudge that wasn't even theirs to hold on to. Their harassment and bullying of the people of Israel had grown into outright opposition, and they would answer for it. Once again, remember, Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, God said, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. That promise went from Abraham to Isaac and from Isaac to Jacob. Esau was now a curse to Israel. So what would God do to them? He would curse them. And this curse would see them completely destroyed. This curse, basically, let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of a modern day Edomite? I'm not just making that pause because you're unable to answer through the screen. This is pre-recorded, but understand, there are none left. They were wiped out at the last recorded Edomite bloodline with the family of Herod the Great, who for the most part died of either complications from inbreeding or outright divine retribution. Let me give you some examples. Herod the Great, And this was actually an ironic title because the guy was actually pretty short. But they called him great, not just to make fun of him, but because he was a fantastic architect. He was the one who built the temple that was around during Jesus' time. And the foundations of that temple still just baffle archaeologists, them too, but architectural experts, just how they were able to move these massive stones, some of which weigh more than two 747 jets, that were able to be not only cut so finely that they just slid on top of each other, and because of the sheer weight of these stones, there was just no moving them. They didn't need concrete to keep them in place. They were just so massive and so finely cut. All of these things that he accomplished, but understand as well, as good a builder he was also very paranoid. He, for example, one of his wives, Miriam, kept having male children, and in that culture, the male child was the one who would inherit the throne. And he got it into his head that, oh, she keeps having sons. Why isn't she having daughters? She's doing it on purpose. She's making these boys come out as sons because she's threatening to overthrow me. So he had his wife and her sons killed. Then felt bad about it later and built her a giant tomb, which is still standing today. But this guy was nuts, and he ended up dying ultimately from what most would report as a kidney infection. This guy had some serious health issues. But what's interesting too is this was also the guy who tried to murder Jesus as an infant. The wise men from the east came and asked, "Where's the one who was born king of the Jews?" And Herod's like, "I'm the only king. What are you talking about?" He says, "Oh, well, the prophecies right here say that a king's going to be born in Bethlehem. We saw a star in the east and we want to come and visit." And he said, "Okay, when you find him, tell me where he is so I can worship him too." His intentions were obviously not to do that, but when Jesus escaped, what did he do when 2 years had passed and he didn't hear back from the wise men? He said, "Murder every single baby 2 years and younger in the city of Bethlehem. Make sure this king doesn't take over my line." And, well, responsible for mass infanticide as well as just being an outright psychopath. He ended up dying from complications to his health. Another Edomite, an Idumean, a descendant of Esau, was Herod Antipas. Probably grandson or great-grandson of Herod the Great. He ended up dying in Roman exile to Gaul, which was be modern-day France, but it was populated by a lot of scary people back then, so probably ended up dying there. This Herod Antipas, in case you don't know, was the guy who ordered John the Baptist to be beheaded, and was also the one that Pilate sent Jesus to be tried before in court. And when Herod Antipas wanted to see Jesus perform a miracle, "Why don't you share your message with me?" Jesus didn't say a word to him. He had officially given up on this man. And that's a scary thing to consider yourself as far as your position before God to be, where Jesus has nothing to say to you. The last Edomite to exist, at least on record, was Herod Agrippa. And this guy was very active in the book of Acts. You know how he died? He was struck dead by God, and then worms ate his brain. Oh, by the way, this was the guy who ordered the Apostle James to be murdered. The first of the original eyewitnesses and the biological brother of Jesus. He was ordered to be murdered by Herod Antipas. Herod Agrippa, my apologies. And Herod Agrippa, interestingly enough, he also tried to murder Peter. An angel intervened. He still had other things to do before God would take him home. But interestingly enough, God saw him dealt with personally. So obviously not a blessed family line. Verse 17, "But on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance." Zion is a name for Jerusalem. "There shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions." So he's saying, Jacob, they're going to inherit your territories. Your little brother that you've constantly been a harassment to, the one you've been trying to get up over, when I'm done dealing with you, I'm going to give all your stuff to them. Talk about salt in the wound. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau shall be stubble. They shall kindle them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. The south, referencing Israel once again, shall possess the mountains of Esau, and the lowland shall possess Philistia, once again, nearby territories. They shall possess the fields of Ephraim, the fields of Samaria. Benjamin shall possess Gilead. Remember, Benjamin, just this really, really small nation in the southern portions of Israel, he would control the farmlands in the north. Everything that the northern tribes had ultimately abandoned, everything that the Edomites wanted and tried to rob from the people of Israel, God would give it all back to them, and in abundance. Because notice this, he says, and the captives of this host of the children of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. Now, this is in the Negev Valley, so we're noting national borders here today. The captives of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad, they shall possess the cities of the south. Then the saviors shall come to Mount Zion, to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Now catch this. The regions that used to belong to Israel's enemies will be returned to them. Those who stood against Israel in battle, they're going to possess their lands. The Philistines, the Canaanites, but the Edomites, where would their territory go to? Their massive fortress rock cities, where would they be ruling? Or rather, whose territory would they be consolidated to? It says God himself is going to own that land. He's going to be the one to take this over. He will rule over it. And this is, of course, a reference to the coming kingdom that we're looking forward to in Revelation 20. But understand all of this. When Jesus returns, restores the earth, the violence that basically just defines life in the Middle East is finally done away with. The environment is restored. The judgment of God will ultimately see all of these places that were just made desolate because of the judgment of God. God's going to restore and give to his people. And when we're talking about the nation of Israel, understand what brought such a judgment on the Edomites, on the descendants of Esau, that they were completely wiped from the face of the earth, that everything that they had was ultimately given to the people who followed God. It was because of their treatment of the people of Israel. They continued to be political enemies, they continued to be emotional enemies, and when they finally descended into physical enemies, God returned that curse on them. And then some. If anyone here calls themselves Christians, don't you dare say a word against God's chosen people. These are the ones that God has used to physically enter into this world as an ethnic Jew. And regardless of your feelings towards them, they deserve our not only love, but support. Not just because of the obvious moral high ground that they call for, that's just basically due to them when they're surrounded by these barbarians today, but also understand this as well. Regardless of how we feel in certain situations, understand that God will be the one to ultimately settle accounts. What they have done, they will answer to him for. What we have done, we will answer to him for. And treatment of his children is very high up there in a category I do not want to find myself in. Anti-Semitism is the most anti-Christ attitude we could ever have. Let it not be found among you. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps never considered reading the book of Obadiah and would benefit from reading and listening to this study, going through it verse by verse, please share this with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. There is areas you didn't understand, references I took for granted, but perhaps you weren't able to catch on with. Happy to answer it in the comments, but just remember most importantly, that Jesus loves you, and he demonstrated that love through the nation of Israel. Don't interfere with God's plans by being an obstacle to him completing his work through the people he's chosen to work through more dramatically and more directly than any other nation in history. I don't want to have that much in common with Esau. I would rather that not be said the same of you either.